Imagine waking up to rain that never stopped. One morning passed, then another, then another. The ground around your camp slowly became mud. Every piece of firewood outside was already soaked. The animals you normally hunted had disappeared. Even crossing nearby rivers suddenly became dangerous, and the rain showed no sign of stopping. For us, this means staying indoors for several days. For ancient humans, it could become a survival crisis. They had no waterproof houses waiting nearby. They had no heaters, dry clothes, or electric lights. Everything they needed depended directly upon nature. So where could they escape when everything became soaked? The obvious answer seems to be a cave, but caves were not always empty or safe. Some were already occupied by dangerous animals. Others could flood when heavy rain continued. So finding shelter was only their first problem. They also needed warmth, food, and something incredibly important. They needed to keep their fire alive. The rain continued falling while everyone searched for shelter. A good shelter needed more than just a roof. It had to stay dry even during heavy rain. The ground beneath them mattered just as much. Low ground could quickly become flooded, so slightly elevated ground became much more valuable. Trees could block some rain, but rarely enough. Large rocks could provide better protection from wind, but rocks could also hide dangerous animals. Every possible shelter came with its own risks. A cave offered darkness, dryness, and protection from wind, but something else might already be living inside. Heavy rain could also turn caves into traps. Water sometimes entered through hidden cracks above. A shelter that looked safe could suddenly become dangerous, so ancient humans had to inspect everything carefully. They watched water movement before settling anywhere. They also searched for signs of animals nearby. But even the safest shelter could not solve everything, because staying dry meant nothing if they could not stay warm. Keeping warm became harder as the rain continued falling. Everything outside was becoming wetter with every passing hour. Dry firewood was becoming harder to find. Without fire, staying warm became much more difficult. The flames also provided light inside dark shelters, but rain could destroy a fire surprisingly quickly. Even a small leak could extinguish precious embers, so they needed to protect the fire carefully. They could place wood beneath dry shelter. They could also shield flames from falling water. But what happened when all their wood became wet? They needed another way to keep flames burning. Some natural materials could catch fire more easily. Dry bark could sometimes protect the precious embers. Resinous wood could also burn longer than ordinary branches. Keeping embers alive became extremely valuable during storms. One glowing ember could save hours of difficult work, but constant rain could eventually defeat even careful preparation. If the fire disappeared, warmth disappeared with it, and restarting a fire during endless rain was another challenge. The rain kept falling while the precious flames grew weaker. Wet wood hissed instead of burning properly. Smoke filled the shelter as the fire struggled. One careless moment could leave everyone sitting in darkness. Without flames, the shelter suddenly felt much colder, so the group protected every remaining ember carefully. They could cover glowing coals beneath dry materials. They could also search for wood protected from rainfall. Branches beneath thick trees sometimes stayed relatively dry. Dead wood hidden inside sheltered places could also help. But eventually, even those supplies could disappear. Then restarting the fire became their biggest challenge. Creating flames required dry tinder and careful preparation. Finding dry tinder after days of rain was difficult. A single mistake could waste their remaining materials, so protecting fire became more important than creating it. An ember carried safely through the storm was priceless. It could become the beginning of another warm fire. But what if every ember finally disappeared? Then they would need to find another way to make fire. Making fire during endless rain was never simple. Wet surroundings made every spark more difficult to protect. They needed something dry enough to catch first. Dry grass could become valuable tinder when carefully protected. Bark fibers could also help start fragile flames. A small spark was useless without something ready nearby. So preparation mattered before anyone even needed fire. People could carry dry tinder inside their shelters. They could also protect useful materials beneath animal hides. Keeping these supplies dry became another daily task. But creating sparks required tools and practiced movements. Different groups used different methods across different environments. Some methods depended on friction between carefully prepared materials. Others relied on striking suitable stones together. Either way, patience mattered more than speed. One successful spark could transform the entire shelter. Warmth returned, darkness disappeared, and wet bodies relaxed. But making fire was only one part of surviving indoors. With hunting impossible, another question became increasingly important. What could they eat while the rain kept falling? Rain could stop hunting for several days at once. Wet forests made tracking animals much more difficult. Fresh footprints disappeared quickly beneath flowing water. Hunters could waste hours searching without finding anything. So food already inside the shelter became extremely valuable. Dried meat could provide energy while hunting was impossible. Nuts and seeds could also survive bad weather. Roots hidden beneath the ground offered another food source. Some plants remained available despite continuous rainfall, but gathering plants during storms was not always safe. Rising streams could suddenly make familiar paths dangerous. So people had to balance hunger against exposure. They also needed enough food for everyone. Children and older people depended on the group's supplies. A long storm could slowly reduce those precious reserves. That made preserved food incredibly important. But food was not the only thing they needed. Rain also changed the way they spent their time. For days, hunting and traveling could become nearly impossible. So what did humans actually do while trapped inside? Days trapped inside the shelter could become surprisingly productive. Hunters could repair weapons while waiting for better weather. Broken spear points needed careful attention before the next hunt. Animal hides could also be cleaned and prepared. Wet clothing needed time near the fire to dry. People could sharpen stones while listening to the rain. Others could prepare wooden tools for future journeys. The storm created something rare, uninterrupted time. Nobody needed to spend every daylight hour hunting. Nobody needed to travel across dangerous flooded ground. Instead, everyone remained close to the shelter. That forced people to spend more time together. Children could watch adults making tools and preparing food. Older members could pass practical knowledge to younger ones. Stories could also be shared around the fire. Skills that normally required weeks could be practiced repeatedly. Even boredom could become useful under the right conditions. But something even more important may have happened. The shelter became more than somewhere to escape rain. It slowly became a place where humans could create. Rain kept the hunters inside, but their hands stayed busy. Stone tools could be repaired beside the fire. Broken edges could be sharpened for future hunts. Animal bones could also be shaped into useful tools. Wooden shafts needed careful preparation before becoming spears. Dry fibers could be twisted into strong cords. Hides could be scraped, softened, and prepared for clothing. None of these tasks required clear skies. In fact, rain created more time for careful work. The shelter became a temporary workshop for everyone. Children could watch skilled adults working nearby. Watching was one of the easiest ways to learn. Repeated practice could turn observation into useful skills. Knowledge could spread without written instructions. Every storm offered another opportunity to practice. Tools made indoors could later improve outdoor survival. The rain outside was limiting their movement, but inside, their abilities were quietly expanding. And something even stranger could happen during long storms. Humans could begin leaving marks behind. The storm continued while strange marks began appearing around the shelter. Someone could press wet pigment against a cave wall. Another person could scratch shapes into soft surfaces. These marks may have carried meaning for the group. Nobody needed sunlight to create them. Firelight could illuminate the walls during long evenings. The shelter suddenly became more than protection from weather. It became a place for ideas to survive. People could create while the storm continued outside. Some images may have represented animals they knew. Others may have recorded experiences from earlier hunts. We cannot know exactly what every ancient mark meant. But surviving cave art proves humans created during confinement. Long periods indoors gave people opportunities to experiment. They could mix pigments, test shapes, and repeat patterns. The rain outside could not stop their imagination. Instead, it may have created precious time for creativity. And creativity was not the only thing growing inside. Human relationships were also becoming stronger around shared shelters. So, what happened when an entire group stayed together? Rain kept everyone together inside the same shelter. Nobody could simply walk away for another hunting trip. Families spent more hours sitting beside one another. Children watched adults repair tools and prepare food. Older people had more opportunities to teach younger members. Stories could be repeated until everyone remembered them. important knowledge could travel through spoken words. Hunters could describe where animals had recently moved. Others could explain which plants were safe to eat. Someone could warn children about dangerous places nearby. These lessons were valuable because nobody had written instructions. Memory became one of their most important survival tools. Long rainy days created more opportunities to share knowledge. People also had more time to observe one another. Cooperation became easier when everyone stayed close. A storm could therefore strengthen bonds within the group. But staying together also created another important problem. Food supplies could disappear faster than anyone expected. What happened when the rain lasted even longer? Soon, finding enough food became their biggest challenge. The rain continued while their food supplies slowly disappeared. Fresh meat was becoming harder to replace each day. Hunters could not simply leave whenever they wanted. Flooded paths made familiar hunting grounds difficult to reach. Animals also moved away from flooded areas. That made finding fresh tracks increasingly difficult. The group had to rely on whatever remained nearby. Stored foods suddenly became more valuable than fresh kills. Nuts, seeds, roots, and dried meat could extend supplies. Every meal now needed to be carefully considered. Nobody knew when the rain would finally end. Eating everything quickly could create a dangerous shortage. Saving too much could also leave people hungry, so the group had to balance hunger against uncertainty. Children could depend heavily on whatever adults had stored. Older people might struggle more during food shortages. The entire group therefore had to cooperate carefully, but rain could sometimes create unexpected food opportunities. Some animals became easier to find near flooded ground, and that meant the storm was not always their enemy. The storm had lasted long enough to change the landscape. Rivers became wider and familiar paths disappeared underwater. Fresh water was suddenly available almost everywhere. Small pools formed across places that were usually dry. Some animals gathered around these new water sources. Others moved toward higher ground to escape flooding. Hunters could sometimes follow these movements after rainfall. Wet ground also preserved footprints surprisingly well. Reflex could reveal which animals passed nearby. The same rain that erased old trails created new ones. Plants also responded when the soil became saturated. Some roots became easier to dig from softened ground. Certain foods could become more accessible after heavy rain. The storm was no longer only something to endure. It was beginning to reshape their entire environment. Once the rain stopped, the landscape would look different. Animals would leave new tracks across the softened ground. Hunters could use those tracks to plan their next journey. But before leaving, they still faced one final problem. What had the endless rain done to their shelter? At last, the rain began falling less heavily. Then, after days of darkness, the clouds finally opened. Sunlight slowly returned across the soaked landscape. Everyone stepped outside after spending so long inside. The familiar world suddenly looked completely different. Paths had disappeared beneath mud and standing water. Branches had fallen across places they once knew. The river had become wider and faster, but the storm had also left useful clues. Fresh animal tracks covered the softened ground. Hunters could finally follow them again. Some animals had returned toward newly formed water sources. Others had moved into higher, drier ground. The hunters now had something they lacked before. They could read the landscape through its changes. The storm had temporarily rewritten their entire hunting ground. Every new footprint revealed where something had traveled. Every broken branch revealed another possible movement. After days indoors, the world outside finally offered answers, but the rain had left them something far more valuable. The storm had changed more than the landscape around them. It had also changed what humans could learn. Fresh tracks now covered the softened ground. New water sources appeared across familiar hunting territories. Broken branches revealed movements from animals passing through. The hunters could follow these clues more easily. Rain had erased some evidence, but created other evidence that made the landscape temporarily easier to read. The group could discover routes they rarely noticed. They could also find where animals gathered after storms. Every heavy rainfall became another lesson about their environment. Over generations, those lessons could become shared knowledge. People learned which places flooded first during storms. They learned which shelters stayed dry the longest. They learned where animals moved when rivers rose. They learned where plants became easier to gather afterward. The rain was no longer simply something to survive. It had become another part of understanding nature. But perhaps the greatest discovery happened inside the shelter. For the first time, they had something humans rarely had. For days, rain had forced everyone to slow down. They could not hunt, travel, or explore normally. Instead, they stayed together inside one small shelter. They repaired tools while listening to the rain. They prepared food while watching younger children. They shared stories that might otherwise remain forgotten. They watched skilled hands and learned through repetition. They created marks that could outlast the storm. The rain had taken away their freedom to travel, but it had given them something unexpectedly valuable. It had given them time to stay together, time to teach, practice, remember, create, and simply talk. Perhaps some ancient knowledge grew during moments like these. Perhaps important stories were born beside those fires. Perhaps the storm strengthened bonds between people. We can never know exactly what happened inside, but ancient shelters preserve traces of those forgotten days. The rain eventually stopped, but its effects remained. What looked like a week of misery may have created something important. Sometimes, surviving the storm meant having time to become more human.